Hello, and welcome to
Small talk about the big issue. I'm Lorraine.
And I'm Kiara.
Welcome back.
Welcome back, yes. So, now that we've closed off this series of introductory episodes, we're excited to start delving into our first topic.
Yes.
Which we decided was going to be biodiversity and the biodiversity loss that is occurring worldwide right now, and what this means, and how biodiversity is important, in fact, crucial, to help us solve the climate change crisis.
Exactly. I think this is a concept a lot of biologists are familiar with, but I don't know to what extent it's intuitive and the mechanisms that underlie it are accessible to people who don't have biology degrees.
Exactly. As I study ecology, one could think that I'm really in my comfort zone right now, but that also means that I have to be really careful about the terms that I use and explaining things really clearly, because when you study something so in depth, you kind of lose touch with what you think other people know about the topic.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So I'll do my best to start from scratch and slowly build up to a level of knowledge that is necessary to understand why biodiversity matters, especially in the context of the climate change crisis. So let's start by defining biodiversity. Biodiversity stands for biological diversity. And if you care a little bit for etymology, it comes from the Greek word bios, which means life. So biodiversity is simply the diversity of life, the diversity of all living organisms on our planet.
Hey, I think we're 2 minutes in and I'm already learning things.
Well, that's good. Very concretely, what does that mean? Where can you find biodiversity? Well, everywhere in nature. In a garden, on a lake. Biodiversity in those ecosystems are all the species that can be found there. So in a lake, you'll look at all the animals you can find. The fish, the frogs, the snails, even the insects. But that's not it. You also look at the plants, the algae, for example, the phytoplankton, but also even tinier microorganisms like bacteria. So all of that makes up the diversity of life in a habitat. So this is what we'll be talking about today, all these communities of different organisms living in similar areas.
So things you can see and things you can't as well.
Yes. So we'll see in this episode what makes this biodiversity so precious and why we need to preserve it. But let me start by telling you that we're also at risk of losing a lot of that diversity. There's multiple reasons for that. I can cite a few. For example, a lot of habitats are being destructed by us, by the expansion of cities, but also by deforestation for crop production. At the same time, we're also releasing a lot of chemical pollution. So I think numbers speak for themselves. There's approximately 300 to 400 millions of tons of toxic waste being dumped in our natural waters yearly.
Do you know where these come from?
Agriculture, the industry, heavy metals, solvents, which of course can either kill animals, species, plants, or greatly hinder their survival. On top of that, there's also climate change, global warming, which affects all ecosystems on Earth, from wetlands to deserts, mountains, forests. And these threats are all acting together. There's a report that came out in 2019 that figured out that 1 million species worldwide were at risk of extinction in the next decades, which is enormous.
Do you know, as an ecologist, how many species we know of? Because I know we have a lot left to discover.
That's for sure.
But I'm curious, 1 million seems humongous. I don't think I can definitely not name 1 million of anything, let alone species. But, what proportion of life does that encapsulate?
If my internet was faster, I could come up with an answer really quickly. But here it says that there's over 2.1 million species which have been described by scientists, but that it is estimated that there could be from 3 million to 100 million more than what we know right now, because there's species being discovered every year. So 1 million out of 2 million described species is half.
Yeah, the consequences of which are catastrophic.
Which we'll get into. I said global warming affects all these ecosystems and therefore contributes to biodiversity loss. You might be wondering how. We mentioned a few reasons already due to ocean acidification, for example, but also rising temperatures, which means that diseases or invasive species get to travel further north or have wider ranges and can contaminate more animals, including us.
Mm-hmm.
So, in order to escape all these threats, organisms have two choices. They can either migrate, but that is not always possible, especially when you consider altitude migration for plants, which need specific requirements in mountains and due to the rising temperatures, need to migrate upwards at higher latitudes to satisfy their need for a low temperature. Well, at some point, the mountain doesn't get any higher, so these species disappear.
But also higher up, the air gets thinner. And so if you're a plant
Yeah.
relying on gaseous exchanges to
Mhm.
survive, then I think at some point it gets problematic. That's why at the top of mountains, there's rarely any plant coverage.
Of course, generally speaking, species might migrate towards environments that are not suitable for them, but they have no choice because they're fleeing from another environment which is dangerous for them. So when migration doesn't work, species also have the choice to adapt. Adaptation is something I've studied a lot, evolution in the broad sense. People might think when you talk about evolution that at some point one animal or a few animals just decide to, I don't know, grow wings and leave the land. But that's usually not how it works. The way this works is that you need to have a relatively big population because those changes that occur in animals to allow them to adapt occur at a genetic level. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but what you need to know is that every single physical change, morphological change that you can observe in animals that help them adapt to a different climate, to different conditions, starts on a genetic level. And with biodiversity loss, the problem is that the number of individuals within a population drastically decreases. But that also means that the genetic diversity within that group decreases. And it is that genetic diversity which allows them to evolve. If you take a group of 1,000 animals of one species, there's a much higher likelihood of one of their babies being born with a new trait that could be favorable in terms of adapting to climate change, compared to if you only had a population of 10 individuals. And this is applicable to larger scales as well.
Mm-hmm.
So the problem with biodiversity loss is that you lose a lot of genetic diversity. And by losing that genetic diversity, you lose the potential of species to produce offsprings that could potentially adapt due to genetic mutations, variations to new conditions. And those offsprings, the ones that are lucky enough to have this one very favorable mutation, they will then be favored in this new climate and produce more offsprings. And that's how a population evolves. But so, as I said, biodiversity loss really hinders that process and accelerates species extinction.
Mm-hmm. You start having fewer entry cards into the genetic
Mhm.
lottery. And also inbreeding is a problem.
Yes, yes, yes. So this is one way that biodiversity is important. There's also another way that I started mentioning in a previous episode when I mentioned grasslands in marine ecosystems. And that is that biodiversity provides services to us, to humankind, but also to the rest of the planet. So we already defined what ecosystem services were. Those are all the beneficial contributions that organisms provide to us, things that have been valued to up to 3 trillion US dollars per year.
What kind of things do these include? Can you give examples of ecosystem services?
Of course, there's, for example, pollination by bees, which sustains 1/3 of our crop production yearly. There's also carbon capture by diverse ecosystems. There's forests, of course, that you know of, but we also mentioned grasslands, which account for 10% of the carbon absorption in oceans. In general, the ocean is a really good carbon sink. It absorbs around 50% of human-induced CO2 emissions. So this really contributes in keeping the climate cooler. And so the thing is that everything is interconnected in our environments. If you start playing around with one species, one parameter, there's a big chance that it might lead to further, bigger consequences within one ecosystem. So this is why biodiversity loss, even when regarding, for example, seagrass communities, is crucial, because in those ecosystems, so many species rely on one another, and removing one or two could have drastic effect on a much larger scale than what you would think. And it's also really hard to quantify it right now and to estimate the impact that species losses could have on global ecosystem services. So it's something we really need to be careful about, because there's little known on the risks linked to certain species disappearing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to give kind of an obvious example, you think of predation. If either the prey or the predator disappears, that's going to really unbalance the ecosystem. In one case, there might be a species that's starving.
Yes.
And in the other case, if you've got too many herbivores, they tend to have a severe impact on the vegetation, and one that's not always beneficial at all.
Yes, that is entirely correct. So now that we've hopefully made clear why biodiversity is so important, why it's very crucial to protect it, I wanted to finish off this first part of the episode by explaining how concretely biodiversity can help with climate change. Of course, there's a very concrete way we just discussed with all those ecosystem services. If you lose one species or more, this could really change the dynamics of how the oceans uptake our CO2 and therefore accelerate global warming. But on another level, there's also very concrete ways that biodiversity helps us face the consequences of climate change. So wetlands, for example, they are crucial in helping us counteract big events of flooding, because all the trees, they're big sinks for water, and they can really attenuate the effects of such a big event. Trees, at the same time, create much cooler microclimates in summer, so this really helps when there's heat waves, which are also going to increase in frequency and in intensity over the years. As we previously mentioned in another episode, coral reefs also help us against really big waves and storms and sea level rises by protecting the coastline and making sure that not too much erosion happens. So we should really focus on stopping the destruction of all of those very precious ecosystems that provide such crucial and valuable services to us.
Can I add, my understanding is also biodiversity within these crucial ecosystems is so important, because the more diversity you have, so the more different kinds of organisms you have, including ones that might fulfill the same function that you mentioned, like trees for erosion, for example. If you have the same kind of tree and there's, for example, a pest that's coming in,
Yes.
or a particularly dry year and these trees aren't very drought resistant, they might all die. And so you'll lose that ecosystem function. And the importance of diversity is that you're covering your bases, basically.
Yeah.
So that if you have more different types of organisms, even if one disappears, it can be replaced by another.
Yes, that's a really good point to make. I think there's 3 levels of biodiversity that are being mentioned. There's genetic diversity, which is at a very molecular level. Then there's species diversity, which you just mentioned. And then there's habitat or ecosystem diversity, which comprise all the different ecosystems on Earth. And all 3 levels are really important to maintain and preserve.
Okay, I had never thought of diversity like this, but all 3 levels contribute to the resilience of either the species or the environment in a way that allows ecosystems and their functions to bounce back in the event of a disturbance, which climate change is a huge disturbance.
And the more we play with all those interactions, the more we're at risk of disrupting them. And those are all consequences that are very hard to predict. So our aim, our main focus should be to make sure that not too much disturbance reach them in order to allow them to keep functioning the way they do, because they are necessary to our well-being on this planet. Not just very concrete economical well-being by providing very precious functions, but also by providing us with spaces of well-being. It's been shown that a lot of people enjoy being in forests and nature. So I've covered the ground I wanted to cover in my introduction, so feel free to take it away.
That's really interesting. If I summarize what I learned, you explained that genetic diversity within a species is important because it allows that one specific species to be more adaptable in the face of climate change, just because it's got a bigger gene pool. You talked about diversity in species, so having multiple different species that have maybe the same ecosystem function or complementary ecosystem functions that help one another. And that means that the environment and the functions that is able to give us or other species are more resilient in the face of disturbances. Was there anything else?
I don't think that it's anything I mentioned, but I realize there's maybe one last point that's important to make. We're losing biodiversity because of human-induced changes like habitat destruction or pollution, but we're also losing it due to climate change. And this triggers biodiversity loss, which then in turn exacerbates the effects of climate change. So again, we're faced with a very dramatic negative feedback loop. The fact that climate change is happening makes us lose species, which puts ecosystem services at risk and therefore exacerbates the effects of climate change. And it's a feedback loop that can easily get out of control unless we do something about it.
This is something I learned, I think, in the episodes we've done so far, that really climate change is all about negative feedback loop, it seems. Like, if it could just get onto the positive side, that would be great.
Yeah, that's the goal.
Exactly. Thank you for this introduction. In the second part of this episode, I wanted to discuss an article that really stuck out to me.
Yeah.
Because it discusses not just kind of what you've explained so far, which is that biodiversity increases resilience of ecosystems, but also it presents evidence that biodiversity actively mitigates climate change. So it has an effect on climate change.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Very exciting. And it's based on this forest experiment that was done in Panama. And I was really happy that it was a forest environment that it focused on, because I think forests are maybe relatable ecosystems. I think most people have, an idea of what a forest environment is, either because they've been in one or they, likely seen pictures or in literature, books, I feel like forests come up. And personally, I decided a few years ago that forests were my favorite ecosystems, above the beach, above the mountain.
Yes.
What's your favorite ecosystem? Would you say? This is a very
on top of my head, I would have said the mountains, but I have to say that I prefer the lower range mountains where there's still a lot of forests. I really love those pine trees and moss-covered grounds.
I'm more of a deciduous tree kind of person, so trees that have leaves and they fall in the autumn. And also, the topic of forest maintenance is somewhat close to my heart, in the sense that I was lucky to grow up in a place where I had kind of relatively easy access to a forest. And as I've grown up, I've noticed regularly this forest is maintained in such a way that a segment of it will be entirely cut down and then replanted with the same species in these like neat rows, and they're protected from wild boars and deer with these plastic wraps. And it looks a bit desertic when you enter a zone that has just been replanted like this.
Of course. So that's mainly for wood production, is it not?
Yes. And it really does mean that the forest is treated as a resource and something we're going to grow.
As an economic good.
Yeah, which is one way to see a forest. But I think it definitely does pose ecological issues that this article addresses. And it's called Diversity Increases Carbon Stocks and Fluxes Above but Not Below Ground in a Tropical Forest Experiment. It's a very long title, so I'm going to say it again. Tree diversity increases carbon stocks and fluxes above but not below ground in a tropical forest experiment.
Okay, I think you'll have to explain carbon stocks and fluxes to us, but I'm really excited to see where this is going.
I will. It was published earlier this year, in January 2025, and it presents findings from an international team led by Florence Schnabel, and the experiments were performed in the Sandinilla experiment, which is found in Panama, the country that links North America and South America and is famous abroad for its canal. And the Sandinilla experiment is the oldest tropical tree diversity experiment. And it's been running since 2001. And this article looks at data collected from it from 2001 to 2017. Now, the advantage of looking at tropical trees is that they grow faster. than those in temperate regions. So you're able to maybe get your diversity results faster as well. And it's also a very interesting site because it's weathered very harsh conditions. So there was a particularly wet year in 2010, and then there was a drought in 2016. Hurricane Otto hit it in 2015. Wow. So it's seen a lot of perturbation.
And do they look at the impact of those perturbations on the trees?
So they can't isolate the impact of one event on tree diversity, but all the plots were affected in the same way, and so they can see how resilient this experiment is. And so the Sandinilla experiment focuses on the study of the effects of tree diversity. So as you've said, Kiara, ecosystems that have many different species are known to be more resilient. And so in the case of tree species, they're going to be more resilient to droughts and storms and things like this. And it's important to study tree diversity, particularly nowadays, when there's increasing effort to restore forests and use them as tools to mitigate climate change through carbon sequestration.
Yes. Carbon sequestration is a bit of a mouthful.
Yes. I wanted to explain.
Sure. That's good.
Because I think also this has come up a couple times in the podcast, and I definitely want to keep talking about it because this is something I'm quite interested in.
As a plant scientist?
Yes.
But also as a climate scientist, it's very relevant.
I don't know if I can claim the title of climate scientist. Maybe climate
knowledge facilitator.
So sequester is a term for storing and kind of locking away. And we're interested in locking away carbon because there's too much of it in our atmosphere. And plants are these really cool organisms because they have the ability to absorb carbon dioxide from the air and convert it into organic matter. And that locks away carbon from the air. And so it decreases the greenhouse gas effect.
We've called them superheroes before because I think that's a real superpower.
But a lot of current pledges for forest restoration focus on planting just one species. And that can be particularly ineffective if that's a non-native species of tree.
A species that may be valued for its economic purpose, but not really for its ecological properties.
Yes. And so it might not serve, if you will, the native species in that environment. So if the birds can't use it to nest, if the if the animals can't feed on the leaves, stuff like that.
Yeah. And everything is interconnected. So if the birds' numbers go down, then there's going to be more insects carrying more diseases. And again, another cascade of very, very bad events as soon as you lose biodiversity.
Yeah, unfortunately. So what does the Sandinilla experiment do and to teach us about tree diversity? And so what they did is that they had different plots of land, and each plot had a different number of tree species. So from 1 to 5, and the tree density was constant. So you had, for the same area, the same number of trees. So it's not a factor of, having more trees on one plot than the other. And as I said, the sampling time was 16 years. So they had really a long span of time to study the effects of diversity. And this is good because we were interested in long-term carbon storage. So if you got a plant that's absorbing carbon 1 year, but then dies off and just, recycles that organic matter and might be released into the atmosphere again, it's not really interesting. We want long-term carbon storage, and that's why trees are really exciting.
So what in particular did they sample in those trees?
They sampled both above ground and below ground carbon. Above ground carbon is things like the sum of the weight of the trunks and the branches, the grass cover at the base of these trees. Below ground carbon is going to be things like root carbon, the soil organic carbon, so the carbon that's found within the soil, the microbes within the soil.
So how do they translate the amount of trunks and branches into carbon?
So, they know how much carbon is found in wood, and then that might vary across species, and because they know which species they have ways of estimating this. And this article is very interesting because most studies focus on above ground carbon just because that's what we can see, basically. So it's easier to sample, it's easier to measure.
Yeah.
So I've explained what carbon stocks above ground and below ground are.
Yeah.
But the title also mentioned carbon fluxes. And carbon fluxes are the flows of carbon between above ground and below ground. So leaves on the ground will decompose, turn into organic soil carbon, and that might help trees grow. So what did they find? They find initially, in the earlier time points that they sampled, that plots with 2 or 3 species are more productive. So the plants are growing more, but with time, more diversity leads to more production. And this is a positive feedback loop.
Ooh.
So we talk about negative feedback loop, but biodiversity leads to a positive feedback loop in the sense that more diversity allows you to get more production through, for example, less resource competition, because different trees might be using slightly different resources, and so it means that they're all able to thrive.
In ecology, we call this niche partitioning, but it means that in order to coexist in the same habitat, species need to rely on slightly different resources or inhabit slightly different spaces so that all can coexist and not steal each other's resources. And if at some point 2 species enter competition, then usually it leads to the disappearance of one because it gets outcompeted. It's very rare to find 2 species which rely exactly on the same resources, on the same niche.
Okay. So my understanding is when you have more diversity, you have more neat resource partitioning. But you also mentioned, for example, that at the base of trees, you can get this kind of cooling effect.
Yeah.
And so that means that maybe you're getting more water retention, also because the roots are there to capture more water. And so these plots with more biodiversity are able to use a lot more resources just because everyone is pulling from different parts of that ecological niche. So this finding is if you look at both above ground and below ground carbon stocks. But remember, they looked at specifically above ground and below ground. So if you separate, tree diversity increases above ground carbon stocks. So you get this 57% increase in above ground carbon stocks.
That's huge.
And the most diverse plots in the ones with 5 species compared to the ones with 1 species after 16 years. That's quite a bit.
It is huge.
I feel like that's an interesting finding.
Yeah. Okay.
And this positive tree diversity effect strengthens over time. So you're able to get more and more.
Yeah. You mentioned that in the very beginning of the experiment, it showed an opposite trend, that there was more carbon capture by less diverse plots. Do you know why that might be?
Okay, I'm going to stipulate here and give kind of an example, but I think this could be extended to other phenomena. But imagine you have a diverse plot, and I'm one species of tree, and you're another species of tree. And naturally, I grow taller faster. So maybe we actually will be in more competition because I'll be stealing light from you because I'm taller and I get more light. But in a less biodiverse plot, everyone's growing mostly at the same speed. So maybe there's less competition early on. But then these effects kind of get balanced out by the beneficial effects of having more biodiversity.
Yeah, because at some point the same species will rely on the same resources, and this will increase the competition within species and allow environments with a broader diversity of species to thrive.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
However, if I go back to the title of the article, it mentions that this diversity effect isn't noticeable for below ground carbon stocks. I was quite surprised and quite perplexed.
I am too. Could they explain this?
So they had several possible explanations for this. What they noticed is that in the later stages of their experiments, after 16 years, there was actually less carbon being stored below ground than at the beginning of the experiment for more diverse plots.
Okay. Does this mean that it has been released or that they just started storing it in a different place?
So more diverse plots do tend to store more carbon above ground, maybe because they're growing more, but also they're almost victims of their own success, as I understand it.
Oh.
If you have more above ground biomass, it's likely that you're going to have more leaves. Eventually, these leaves will fall. If you've got, and this might be me oversimplifying, but essentially if you've got such a healthy ecosystem, there are loads of microbes ready to decompose things because they have so much to live off of. That decomposition happens very quickly, and so the carbon in leaves and things that are falling to the ground in general don't stay in the soil long enough. They're eaten up by microbes, and these microbes can release CO2 back into the atmosphere.
Yes. By
respiration. The same process as we do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so basically it means that there's proportionally less carbon staying below ground in the soil. A more diverse plus.
Okay, so it's a nuanced conclusion.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's interesting that you're mentioning nuance because I wanted to end on the limitations of using forest restoration for mitigating climate change. And the article mentions a couple reasons, and I thought these were quite interesting to discuss. The first point they bring up is that sequestering carbon is a slow process for plants. Trees don't grow overnight. What's so interesting about trees is that you can store carbon for a long time. If you think of an oak, and this is likely not the kind of tree they were looking at in the Sardinilla experiment, it's storing carbon for perhaps hundreds of years.
Unless deforestation happens and you cut them down, and that releases the CO2 usually because you burn the wood. And that usually contributes, yearly, to releasing 64% of all the carbon that has been captured by forests worldwide.
Forest destruction?
Yeah.
Okay. So hence the importance of protecting the forests. But yeah, so for example, to give an example of how slow the carbon sequestration process is, in this Sardinilla experiment, the average of the plots that they were looking at sequestered 1.5 tons of carbon per hectare per year.
Wow.
And the article gives us an interesting reference. A lot of the researchers came from Germany. But if one of them were to fly on a plane one way to Panama, that would release 62 tons of carbon. So basically, if you wanted to offset the emissions of that one person flying one way to from Germany to Panama, you would need about 11 hectares in the Sardinilla planted for a year.
Wow. I think it's really good when those articles include such concrete evidence, concrete references that everyone can relate to.
And in fact, we try to have one resource that we recommend every episode. And the resource that I'd like to recommend for this episode is this ICAO carbon emissions calculator. The ICAO is the International Civil Aviation Organization. And this is a website that essentially allows you to input your flight details, so where you're traveling from and to, and it will generate an estimated CO2 emissions based on that flight. So you can, if you're traveling in the near future, you can check out how much carbon you will be emitting.
And then you can compare that number to the amount of carbon that is being stored in forest worldwide or in seagrass communities and see how long it would take for 1 hectare patch to make up for that flight you just took.
Yes. So the first limitation of using forest restoration for mitigating climate change is that carbon sequestration is a slow process, but also that if this is our only solution, it puts a lot of pressure on land use management. So it might mean that we're, compromising agricultural land or other natural ecosystems. You mentioned the importance of grasslands. If we start planting trees and grasslands, we're losing those grasslands.
I meant underwater grasslands, though.
Oh, okay.
Seagrass meadows.
Yeah, we're not going to be planting trees in the ocean.
I hope I said seagrass meadows instead of grasslands, but if I did, then this is my time to correct this.
And so I'd like to end on this conclusion that I think, and so I'd like to end on this conclusion that forests are really important ecosystems from lots of different perspectives. They're, for reasons that Kiara discussed in the first part of the episode, but also potentially for sequestering carbon and mitigating climate change, and that tree biodiversity is going to be the best way to do that. But also that cannot be the only way that we have of mitigating climate change, that it's not the most efficient way.
Of course, like most solutions, it works best when combined with a lot of different ones to make sure we have a global, all-inclusive result.
Exactly.
But thank you, Lorraine, for this really interesting article. I've learned a lot, and once again, I feel even more convinced about the importance of biodiversity, especially in forests. And I hope that our listeners can also see what biodiversity does for us every day.
I think we're ready to wrap up.
Yeah.
As usual, if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, we're really happy to read them, either in the comment section or
send us an email at smalltalk smalltalk.bigissue@gmail.com. We'll be very happy to read you. And until next episode, stay tuned and see you soon.
Goodbye.
We fact-checked this episode and wanted to clarify a few things. Lorraine says that it's difficult for plants to grow at high altitude because of thinner air. This is indeed the case, as it makes CO2 less available. But lower temperatures, higher wind, and often less nutrient-rich soils also limit plant growth higher in the mountains. Lorraine also states that 1 year of plant growth in the Sardinilla sequesters 1.5 tons of carbon per hectare per year, and that a one-way flight from Germany to Panama emits 62.7 tons of carbon, which is the equivalent to 1 full year's worth of plant growth in 11 hectares of the Sardinilla. If the math seems off to you, here's why. 1 year of plant growth in the Sardinilla does sequester 1.5 tons of carbon per hectare per year, but a one-way flight from Germany to Panama emits 62.7 tons of CO2 equivalent. Carbon atoms and CO2, which is made up of carbon and oxygen atoms, have different weights, and 1 ton carbon is equal to 3.7 tons of CO2. This explains the article's findings that plant growth in 11 hectares of the Sardinilla would offset 1 flight to Panama. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening.